So good afternoon and a warm welcome to all members of the Radley community and to our school partners who've joined us today on Zoom. My name's Caroline Monaghan and I'm responsible for our Beyond Radley Career Speaker Programme, a series of talks designed to give you a live insight into the world of work. Our speaker today is going to talk to you about what he did immediately after he left school, as he didn't go straight to university, and tell you about how he worked out that he wanted to work for a charity, a career which he now finds hugely challenging, rewarding and fulfilling. I'll shortly hand you over to our speaker, but before we begin, just a quick reminder of a few things. Please keep your microphones on mute. If you wish to ask a question during the talk, then please type it into the chat. There'll be a Q&A session at the end, which will be your chance to grill the expert. The event will be recorded so that other people can watch it at a later date. I'm now going to introduce you to Theo Bromfield. Theo currently works for the David Shepherd Wildlife Foundation, an environmental charity, and manages a portfolio of 17 ground-based wildlife conservation projects in Africa and Asia, whilst also leading their policy work, which focuses on influencing the international policy agenda on biological diversity and wildlife trade. So without further ado, over to you, Theo.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you for having me on this Beyond Radley talk today. It's obviously always difficult doing these things online rather than in person. So I want to keep this as kind of interactive and informal as possible. So please do just kind of cut in, ask questions as and when you please. I also thought quite long and hard about the structure and what I was going to talk about today. But what I really wanted to highlight was that there isn't one solution or one way of doing things when it comes to your career path and your kind of career ambitions. And when I was at school, it was kind of not necessarily through Radley, but it was always drilled into me that you go to school, you leave school, you go to university, you find a job, and that is the traditional structure. And that if you don't go to university, you've missed your chance. And it took me quite a long time to kind of come to terms with the fact that that is not the case. So that was kind of the angle that I'm going to structure this talk in today. So I'm going to try and share my screen quickly, so bear with me. Hopefully. Can you all see that? Perfect. So firstly, as Caroline's already alluded to, I work for a small non-governmental organization called the David Shepherd Wildlife Foundation. It's a conservation organization working to safeguard wildlife and trying to safeguard it for future generations. And I'm going to spend some time talking about the organization itself, what I do, and then also the kind of the path that led me to working here. I'm going to start with a brief video, which I will hand over, which is going to be played. But before I did that, I just wanted to kind of highlight a couple of really key statistics. So the first is that it was a report which came out in 2019 by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. This is quite a lengthy title. It's known as IPBES. But it stated that 1 million species are threatened with extinction. The second was a report by WWF, which came out in 2020, the World Wildlife Fund, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And this report noted that the population sizes of mammals, birds, fish, amphibians, and reptiles have seen an alarming drop of 68% since 1970. What is most terrifying about both of these statistics is that they are anthropogenic in nature. So in a kind of less technical term, they are human-induced. They are caused by human activities such as land degradation, such as climate change, such as agricultural expansion. And this is what makes the third point here probably the kind of the most scary, which is since 1960, our population has doubled and will rise by 50% by 2050. So in short, if we're going to coexist with nature and live within our own planetary boundaries, we're going to need to fundamentally shift our dysfunctional relationship with nature. So before I go on to talk a little bit more about the organisation that I work for and what I do, I've got a quick video which I'm hoping to play. So I'm just going to unshare my screen and get it shared elsewhere, and hopefully it's going to work.
The David Shepherd Wildlife Foundation was set up to conserve wildlife in their natural habitat. So we take a holistic approach to conservation. So that means most of the work that we do has to have a number of elements. So the main one is law enforcement, park protection and anti-poaching being the main part. Education is a key part of what we do, and also community outreach.
That these animals deserve a better fate than to be killed for their ivory.
High-stakes war against trafficking of something worth more than gold, cocaine, even diamonds. The coveted horn of the endangered rhino.
We very much believe that conservation is a long game. It's very important to invest in key projects and make sure that they have a sustainable future. It's safe to say that everyone in the organisation has a fantastic ethos that was built from the legacy that my grandfather set up. So a key part of our DNA is wanting to give back to the wildlife that we are very privileged to be able to see on a daily basis. So one of Grandad's key messages was he felt he owed a debt to wildlife for the success that he was owed through his painting career. So it's incredibly lucky for us that we are able to continue that work with the same passion and dedication that he first started the organisation.
The biggest understanding that I've got from this trip is that without having the communities on board, the poaching problem won't be relieved. So we have to go in and educate, we have to empower those people and those communities, and for those adults to pass that on to their children and their children's children to actually resolve this issue.
The second main objective of the Community Outreach Department is to introduce alternative sustainable livelihoods to those communities living on the borders of national parks so that they're not forced into illegal wildlife activity. And we do most of that through women's empowerment in Zambia.
If you can inspire people to love something like wildlife, like elephants, rhinos, whatever it is, then they will want to learn about it. And if they learn about it, then they'll look to find out how they can make sure that it means something in the future, that it is here for our children and our children's children.
don't do this now, and if we don't create those vital funds to make that change, my children and your children's children won't grow up with this incredible landscape, the incredible wildlife that we see now. It won't happen, and I feel very strongly about making that change, and I hope you'll support us in that.
We've reached a period now when if we don't get it done mighty quick tomorrow, it'll be too late.
Maybe we can stop it there. Sorry, I'm just sharing my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. So I hope that you that kind of video gave you a brief insight into some of the work that we do. My job is split into two core sections, so programs and policy. With regards to the former, I manage our conservation portfolio of 16 conservation projects across 14 countries, working to protect 8 flagship species. So those species are elephants, pangolins, tigers, painted dogs, snow leopards, lions, chimpanzees, and rhinos. I know that there's some discrepancy in the numbers from the film, but that film was created a couple of years ago. And as an organization, we believe in a holistic approach to conservation. So what that means is that we don't believe that there is a single solution into protecting wildlife. We need to work across a range of initiatives. As such, we've split all of our work into 3 core categories, which we kind of conceptualize under fight, protect, and engage. So the first is fighting wildlife crime. We do this through undercover investigations into the illegal wildlife trade and through our international policy work, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. The second core part of our work is protecting wildlife. We do this through funding boots on the ground, so anti-poaching initiatives, the rescue, rehabilitation, and release of wildlife, and through extensive scientific research. And the third is through engagement, which you saw a lot of in the video. And we do this through giving local communities who live neighboring wildlife habitats the tools to coexist with wildlife. The other part of it is working in demand countries to dispel the myths associated with consumption of wildlife. So, for example, in Zambia, we do a lot of work around the Kafue National Park, and we don't believe it's just having boots on the ground and people with guns disincentivizing people to go into the park. We also need to work with people who are poaching wildlife to give them alternative means of income, but also be working with communities in China and Asia who are demanding wildlife products to actually educate them on the myths behind the use of these products. So it's very much a kind of a holistic approach that we take, and we can't have just one size fits all. So the second major part of my work is engaging in the international policy arena to fight for the toughest protectionist policies for wildlife. So the first major part of my job is working under something called CITES. So CITES is the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species. For those who aren't aware, a convention is an international agreement between countries. So CITES is signed by 183 different countries around the world who all follow its mandate. My main focus under this international agreement, which falls under the United Nations, is closing down ivory markets and preventing the live trade of elephants outside their natural range. But CITES has a huge mandate of different fauna and flora which are listed on it. So The second major part of my work is engaging in what's called CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. This convention is signed by 196 countries around the world. And it's a conservation agreement which focuses on the sustainable utilization of biodiversity. So what I do here is I work with a number of different organizations to highlight the links between biodiversity loss and wildlife trade. And the final growing area of my work is on wildlife trade and pandemics. This is very much a new area which has been growing in light of COVID-19. And the body of work which I'm embedded is trying to embed something into the international legal system, which acknowledges the intrinsic link between wildlife trade and pandemics and its subsequent biodiversity loss. It's something that this whole area is kind of a long one to explain and describe. So if anyone has any more kind of specific questions about it, I'm more than happy to go into it in depth in the Q&A. So now that I've given you a very quick snapshot into kind of the organization that I currently work for and what my job role entails, I just wanted to give you a bit of background on how I actually got here. So I left Radley in 2012. And like a lot of people, I decided to take a gap year. I'd been at boarding school since the age of 8, and there was something that just didn't seem quite right about going straight to university, especially that personally, I wasn't that kind of keen to study the topics that I had studied and applied for. So during my gap year, I traveled extensively, and it was during this point that I decided not to go to university. I had extensive conversations with my family, and my dad gave me a really good bit of advice, back in 2012 or 2013, that I should focus on finding out what I wanted to do. And I was really lucky that none of my family had been to university, apart from one of my brothers. Neither of my parents had. So I think I had less pressure as such than some people. But I personally feel that this is something which was never kind of encompassed into any messaging when I was growing up, apart from through my family, that there was a trajectory that one can work towards outside school, which isn't going straight to university and studying something that you know not a huge amount about. So for the next few years after my gap year, I traveled quite extensively. I worked in numerous countries, doing numerous jobs. And to a lot of people, I think I probably looked like I was a little bit lost. And quite a lot of the time, I did feel that I was a little bit lost because my contemporaries and my peers were doing a very, very different thing to what I was doing. However, whilst, a lot of my contemporary Radleyans were at university, during that time, I was doing a lot of other things. I lived in South Africa. I spent 6 months doing a yacht master course. I spent 3 years living in Spain. I lived in Scotland. And it wasn't until 2017, so what is that, 5 years after I left Radley, that all of the things that I had been doing and searching for amalgamated into kind of one career-changing and life-changing event. So since leaving school, I had spent 98% of my time outdoors, and nature was something that I was completely in love with. But it wasn't until I watched a documentary in 2016 called Virunga, which is, I'm not sure how many of you have seen it. If you haven't, it's on Netflix, and it was a huge part of my life, this documentary. It provides an overview of the exploitation of oil from a British company in the DRC, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and its subsequent impacts on wildlife populations, specifically gorillas in the Virunga National Park. And from this documentary and many others that I watched, I myself and a lot of my friends came in awe of these individuals who are fighting on the ground to protect wildlife. The next photo that I'm going to show you is a photo of Rianto, who's one of these guys. But one statistic that kept popping up kind of in our research was that in the last 10 years, more rangers have died protecting wildlife than British troops did in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that really put something in perspective for me, that these kind of unsung heroes who appear in all of these documentaries about wildlife conservation, who never speak, are doing such a fundamentally dangerous job. So this is When Cycling for Rangers, this initiative, which I'm going to talk to you now, this kind of life-changing event for me, started. So in 2017, myself and 3 others, 2 ex-Radleyans, Charlie Rose and Will Johnston, who were in A Social and H Social, we all decided to cycle 5,000 kilometers from Johannesburg to Nairobi through 11 national parks, raising awareness through a documentary and raising vital funds for those on the front line on the war against poaching. And this really was a kind of career changing point for me in my life. So I have a quick teaser kind of a video, which I'm going to quickly show now, which kind of highlights that trip that we underdid in 2017.
All across Africa, there's a deadly war being fought to protect the world's most iconic endangered animals. It's a conflict that has cost more lives than Britain's war in Afghanistan. Yet people on the front line rarely have their voices heard.
I'm like Adam in the Garden of Eden. There should be someone there to take care of this.
This is our unsupported 5-month journey by bicycle through 9 countries and over 8,000 kilometres.
It's the hardest thing I've ever done.
To raise awareness for anti-poaching rangers and bring their stories with us.
My life is after the dogs.
Join us as we ride through national parks.
Going through a game reserve on a bicycle.
Overcome clashes with elephants and brutal terrain, and hear the story of the poaching crisis told by those who really understand, from rangers to poachers.
God has planned something for me.
To civilians caught in the crossfire.
Yeah, it's like war. It's almost like war.
This is Cycling for Rangers.
So I hope that gave you a quick snapshot into this trip, which again, I'm more than happy to kind of go into more depth in the Q&A. But what I really wanted to highlight here is that it was this trip and the journey that I'd kind of gone through to get to this trip, which took my career into a whole different trajectory. Having seen kind of firsthand the challenges facing wildlife across the globe, I decided on returning from this trip to dedicate my life to the environmental sector. I started working for David Shepherd Wildlife Foundation in 2017. I didn't have a degree at the time. I came in at very much entry level, part-time, and doing all sorts of different things. But I completely fell in love with the organization and the vision of the organization, and slowly found my niche in the policy work, which is where I felt that I could make a tangible difference. However much I would have loved working in a national park somewhere in the world, this was an area where I actually felt that what I was doing was making a difference. So since then, as I've been working kind of more and more with this organization for the last 3 or 4 years, I then decided to go to university. So alongside work, I undertook a postgraduate certificate in climate change and development at the School of Oriental and African Studies, which is part of the University of London. I then also took several months out to complete my master's in environmental law, and have basically passed both of those alongside working, and am still with the organization today. So I'm going to kind of conclude now by just highlighting one major point. I don't think that going to university straight from school is a bad thing. I absolutely don't. And I think in some cases it is absolutely essential. However, what I fundamentally do believe is that there needs to be a shift in mentality, that there isn't a singular way of doing something. There are definitely times in my life that I felt like a failure, and that not going to university straight from school was a hindrance to me. But the reality of the situation actually is that people who go to university later in life, and this is not always the case, but in my experience, are more often than not, they have a more rewarding and more useful experience, having found something that they fundamentally enjoy and want to do. So I'm going to kind of wrap up there and bring it to a Q&A.
Brilliant, thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah, no, that's great. Everyone, please do put any questions you have about any of the amazing things that Theo's done onto the chat. I've got a couple of questions that I'd like to ask you, Theo, if you don't mind. First of all, just rewinding back to when you first sort of left Radley, you had your gap year, and you did your cycling for Rangers in your gap year, I believe. That's right, isn't it?
It was actually a few years later. So I'd worked for about 3 or 4 years before that even happened.
Right. So in your gap year, you travelled a bit, did you?
Yeah. So I travelled, all over really, but spent a lot of time in Asia, spent some time in Africa.
Okay, brilliant. So then you went on, and you said that you went and found other jobs in the ensuing years. I just wondered how you went about finding those opportunities. Was it through people that you knew, or did you apply for jobs in places like South Africa? I think you mentioned that. How did you go about finding those opportunities and just sort of extending yourself to travel to other places and find out what you wanted to do?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think the honest answer is I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do. And I don't think that's a problem. What I did do is I had long conversations with my family about the things that I enjoyed. So one of the big ones was sailing. I mentioned briefly earlier that I spent 3 years in Spain, but in my gap year, I went to South Africa for 6 months, and I did a Yachtmasters qualification, which was something that I purely wanted to do because I love sailing. And that took me to living in Spain for 3 years, working on sailing yachts. So it was kind of, after leaving school, it was taking that career trajectory slightly out of it and deciding to follow the things that I wanted to do rather than what kind of on paper would look like a job. And what I was really lucky, I feel like, in that period of time was a lot of my contemporaries, as I've mentioned, were at university, having a great time and often studying things that they wanted to study, but often not. So that was my substitute. I kind of spent 4 years traveling, doing jobs that I wanted to do with people that I really liked and learning a lot about the world and kind of steering myself towards where I've ended up, but with no real proper agenda to it.
Okay, brilliant. And so when you eventually came to apply for university and you decided that's what you wanted to do, because you were a sort of mature student effectively, they're obviously not that much older, was that a difficult process? And two questions really. Was it a difficult process at that stage to then apply for university? And secondly, was it very different going to university as a mature student, did you find?
Yeah, no, it's another really, really good question. And I think when I started out looking at going to university, I was petrified about it because I hadn't studied for, since my A-levels. And I also felt that most of my friends had already gone to university. So there was something that I was very nervous about. The reality of the situation was I was going in as a mature student, but what I learned very quickly when I started my course is that my conception of what a mature student is very different to what the case actually is. And that is a huge amount of people go to university as mature students, or what we would conceive as mature students. And going to university when you're 25, when you're 28, when you're 30 is it's not unheard of at all. So I found that I had a really good group of friends when I went to do my, various courses. And I very much didn't feel I was, with people. I was with people who were younger than me, but I was also with people who are older than me. So I think that was a dilemma in my head, not a reality.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. So when you decided that you wanted to work in the environmental arena and that was the passion that you wanted to pursue, how did you go about finding your job at the David Shepherd Foundation? And again, I'm going to ask you two questions again, sorry. Was it quite a competitive, is it quite a competitive sector to get into? Because I imagine you've got people at different stages in their lives who decide that they want to try and do something that's not necessarily working for a corporate, something that gives back to the world in a different way. So yes, was it competitive, and how did you go about finding that?
Yeah, so what I did, so again, going back to this, this is where the university thing comes in, because I didn't have a degree and I was 25 at the time, 24 at the time, and a lot of people did. And I came out at the back end of this trip knowing what I kind of wanted to do, but I didn't have the qualifications to do it. So what I did, and I think this is something that Radley put me in really good stead to do, was I came back to the trip, I decided that this is what I wanted to do. So I wrote to every single conservation organization that I could find. And I asked them to have a coffee with me, to meet with me, to chat with me, to give me direction. And I had hundreds of conversations with different people. And the David Shepherd Wildlife Foundation was an organization that I met with. I got on really well with. I believed in their vision and their mission, what they were trying to achieve. And I felt that I could bring something to the table. And like I said earlier, I kind of started very much at the beginning and kind of built my way up. And I grew with that organization. I grew to where if I had gone into that organization thinking that I was going to be working in policy, I don't think anyone around me in my life thought that I was going to go to university or that I was going to work in policy. So I think it was that kind of stepping into that. Yeah, it was a slightly bizarre thing. But in terms of being competitive, yes, it is competitive, but it's no more competitive than anything else. And I think it's about the attitude that you go in with. And I think if you really want to work in the environmental sector, or you really want to be a banker, there is a way to do it. It doesn't mean you're going to get the first job. And, especially in the job market that we're in at the moment, it's always going to be tricky, and there's going to be a lot of no's. And I did get a lot of no's. So yes, it's competitive, but I don't think it's any more competitive than a lot of other industries.
Thank you. And what do you feel are the differences between working for a charity versus working for a corporate, in your view?
Oh, that's a really good question. So there's no real right thing to do in a job. A lot of people work to make money. That's absolutely fine. I think what I substitute in my job is I want to, in my own small way, give back to the environment, and I fundamentally enjoy that. And I think those are two very, very different things. And I think there is a kind of bit in between as well, where you can enjoy your job and and you can make money. But I think those are the fundamental differences: is you're working towards a specific purpose, not towards a lifestyle. So there is some ground in between, but I think those are the two big kind of differences as such.
Absolutely, thank you. I've got to ask the inevitable COVID question. I mean, you mentioned it earlier in your presentation about how that part of your work with nature and humanity colliding is something that has become, obviously because of this global pandemic, become an increasing area and workload for you. So how has COVID impacted what you're doing in the last year?
So twofold. And I try and not go on for too long, but one, the obvious, the fundraising aspect of our work, which I'm less involved in, we're struggling. We're struggling to get the money in because there has been an economic downturn across the whole globe, and one of the first things which gets reduced is donations. So we're having to work through that. On the other end of the spectrum is this kind of nexus between wildlife trade and pandemics, which has kind of taken up 98% of my work in the last few months. And that is that as we encroach into nature, the likelihood of zoonotic spillover increases. And the very best way for a zoonotic or an epidemic or a pandemic with a zoonotic origin to spread is through getting a live animal and putting it into a market chain, which is essentially what we're seeing all across the globe. And as this is why that statistic around population growth is so terrifying, that as our population grows and we consume more and we dig further into nature, the chances of zoonotic spillover are increasing. And we are going to see, if we do not fundamentally shift what we are doing, we're going to see a pandemic every 10 years. And they could be a lot worse than this. So we really have to change the way we interact with nature. And that is become, the forefront of my work, which is working in the international kind of policy under kind of the auspice of international law, environmental law, to embed some of these arguments that the way that we trade animals sustainably under, essentially all that we've done, all the international response has done is throw the word safe and graft the word safe on top of business as usual. And in my personal opinion, that's, it's not gonna do a lot to save or stop a future pandemic. So that's kind of how COVID has really taken over the kind of international policy part of our work. And obviously, not only that, it's everything that the wildlife trade links to in terms of biodiversity loss. The demand for ivory has historically driven down elephant populations across Africa. The demand for pangolin scales for traditional medicine in Southeast Asia has, 100 million pangolins have been trafficked in the last 10 years. So anyway, in a nutshell, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, a pretty big impact. So a couple of questions coming through on the chat. Environmental policy will take a long time to change, or can take a long time to change. What does success look like for you to keep going in your work?
Yeah, so that is an incredible question. And I think this is why, going back to what I was saying around holistic approaches to conservation, policy change takes a long time. Changing people's minds takes a long time. Working with communities, neighboring wildlife habitats takes a long time. Engaging with consumers in Southeast Asia and trying to debunk the myths around medicinal properties of pangolin scales takes a long time. So this is why one needs a holistic approach to conservation. We have to fundamentally, those are the root causes of the issues. But what we need to do is actually working on the ground, buying ourselves time whilst these things change, these things do take, like that question insinuated, this takes time. So this is where the kind of more traditional fortress conservation comes in, which is that we fund, as I said, 16 projects across the world where we have anti-poaching rangers on the ground, which are very much there to show that people who are coming in to poach, there are consequences to that. So that is buying time whilst things change, fingers crossed. However, my personal opinion on it is that is not a sustainable model. It's essential to buy ourselves time as we are seeing the biodiversity crisis in the way that it is and how it's ramping up. But it's not a sustainable model. So we also need to work in changing international policy, and we also need to work at working with communities who poach, but also working with consumers.
Thank you, Thea. I've got a little note from Mr. Sparks here. Inspiring stuff, full geography colours. In your opinion, what is the one thing we can do here in the UK that might have the biggest impact on your work overseas?
Yeah, another really good question. And I mean, it's from an environmental perspective, the biggest impact is changing the way that we eat. But that is not to say we should cut meat out entirely. But it is fundamentally a huge driver of biodiversity loss, which relates in wildlife loss, but also climate change. So that is a big one, changing the way and re-evaluating the way that we eat. But in terms of specifically wildlife, what we can do, it's working with, in my opinion, it's working with governments through groups to lobby the international community to actually change our international laws to take into consideration these big decisions that need to be made, because they do funnel that a lot of these international laws, they're not perfect. CITES, as I mentioned, is not a perfect convention. The UNFCCC, where the Paris Agreement sits under, it's not a perfect system. However, what these do set is the fundamentals, which then trickles down international law. It takes time. But I genuinely believe if we can kind of mobilize and push governments to make decisions, that does have a real lasting impact. But it's time consuming, and it takes a lot of effort.
Yeah, it does. And your passion for this clearly shines through for you. So in terms of you personally, what are you in your career so far, what are you most proud of in your working life that you've achieved?
I guess something that I've been working on, which is so going back to David Shepherd, Wildlife Foundation, it's being able to see like tangible, like it's being able to see change. And I think a massive part of this, and this is a very controversial subject, is around domestic ivory bans. So the UK in 2018 bringing in its domestic ivory ban, China bringing in its domestic ivory ban, the US bringing in its domestic ivory ban. We're now lobbying across the EU. There's a public consultation going on at the moment in the EU around the ivory ban, and we're also working, in Japan about trying to push them to do the same thing. And it's when you see, I entered this sector after a lot of work had already been done, but seeing that journey of stuff, this work going on, and actually seeing those outcomes where you see the UK close its ivory market, you see the EU trying to close its ivory market, you see China closing its ivory market, and the knock-on, the domino effect that has to preserve wildlife is huge. So that, I guess, is something working on ivory trade bans is something that I think I'm pretty proud of, because I've been able to see in my lifetime change. And that's why I fundamentally am a bit biased towards the kind of policy interventions, but I genuinely feel that that's where we can have a real impact.
That sounds very rewarding. And for you, again, personally, what is next for you in your career plan? Do you have a sort of a path mapped out, or are you going to see where things take you?
As always, I'm going to see where things take me. I have lots of ambitions. So my master's thesis was not related to wildlife. I've got a huge interest in climate migration. So I did my thesis on responsibility sharing associated to climate migration. So who is responsible when their houses are flooded and they have to move? So Virabatu, the Maldives, when these places no longer exist, which they won't in 30 years, you have entire populations. Under what remit do they stand? So as it stands under the Refugee Convention, unless they are discriminated against, they cannot claim refugee status. So therefore, as it stands, all these people are going to be without home. And just look what happens with a refugee crisis, with a war, and how many problems that causes. Imagine not having any form of international protection. So that is something that I'm hugely interested in. But at the moment, pretty much my sole focus is going to be on wildlife trade and pandemics, and just keep making sure that our projects at David Shepherd Wildlife Foundation remain supported, because essentially their work is fundamental.
Absolutely. And just sort of rewinding back to your time at Radley and the years that you spent here, would you do anything differently?
Yeah, I've actually thought about this recently. Yes, I think it's, but I think it comes down to what mentality am I in? So when I was at Radley, there was so much I took advantage for. And if I was to go back as a 13-year-old in that, 14-year-old in that headspace, I'd probably do the same thing all over again. If I was to go back in my current headspace, it would be to absolutely make the most of everything. No longer would reading a history book be a burden. It would be a luxury. But I think that is, that's something that is, my interests have changed as I've grown up. And I think this also taps back into the kind of the university thing about me not going to university. It took me a while to generate my interests. So, that in itself, I think, is an argument to, again, not always, but that in itself is a reason to maybe second guess, at least think about why you shouldn't go to university, because your interests do change and they do develop. And it's so much better to study something because you're interested in it than because you have to.
No, I totally agree. It makes a lot of sense. Any more questions, please? Oh, hang on. We have got one on the chat now. Are you hopeful for the future?
Yes. Yeah. What I always come back to, and if there's one bit of advice I can give you, there's a podcast run by a girl called who chaired the Paris Agreement. Her name is Christiana Figueres. She has a podcast which is called Optimism and Outrage, I think. And it's all about, a lot of it is around the failures of the Paris Agreement, but it's also about optimism and looking at it from a kind of policy perspective. The Paris Agreement, with the US pulling out, under the Trump era, they're actually now back in it, which is great. There are a lot of hurdles, but there's also a huge amount of optimism. And I think the way that I try and always try and convey this is, yes, look at the stats. The biological crisis is awful. Walk through London for 3 minutes and tell me you haven't seen 10 Teslas, electric cars. The change is so quick. And yes, there is such a long way to go. And yes, we are going to see devastating consequences unless we change. However, there are a few people and a few organizations who are really, really pushing this agenda in terms of trying to find a sustainable world. And if we don't do it now, we are going to regret it for the rest of our lives. But there is a lot to be hopeful for. We as a humanity have the tools to fundamentally change the way that we live and interact with nature. So I am hopeful, but it's going to take some big, bold decisions. And we're all going to have to change the way that we live our lives, which is a scary prospect.
Yes, and people like you fighting the fight as well. So another question here. Have China modified their laws regarding wild animal consumption trade in any way in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, another good question. So China gets an incredibly bad rep when it comes to the environment. So first and foremost, I just want to highlight that they're actually one of the most progressive and forward-thinking countries when it comes to the environment. They invest more money in renewable energy than anyone else in the world. When it comes to wildlife trade, which is obviously something that they have historically been really, really bad at, and I'm not taking them off the hook, but they are looking at introducing a short list of a handful of species which will be able to be consumed, and that handful of species will be a lot less than what we currently have in the UK. Again, China is a funny one because a lot of the information is restricted, and that has come through the international community. For example, when the WHO went in for the first time and Trump started calling this the Chinese virus, the first thing that China did was completely shut down their country to the international community. But looks like they are having some really progressive steps. And I think we've just got to kind of all rally together and acknowledge those steps. And there are a lot of issues still in China, but I don't think we should kind of be pointing the finger at them too much before we have the facts.
Thank you. And just a final question from me, unless anybody else has got anything else they want to pop on the chat. This one's about your Cycling for Ranges trip, actually. What was the hardest part of the trip? Or, was there a moment when you totally doubted what you were doing? A real kind of, why have I started this moment?
Yeah, there were a few. I mean, as I said, I did this with two other Radley boys and a Marlborough boy. And I mean, it was just typical us. I can see Tom Ryder's on the call, so he'll know Charlie Rose, who was an asocial boy with me, and notoriously just kind of wings life. And we didn't train at all for this trip. And we got up on day one, we started cycling, and our bikes were 55 kilograms each. So with all the camera equipment, with all the food, and we were meant to be, we'd set out that we were going to do a minimum of 65k a day. And I think on our first day we were 14k in and had to stop. And I think it was just that realization, it's just like, we've given all the big chat about doing this, this trip and raising all this money and creating a documentary, but we haven't actually thought through the process of being able to complete it. So that first day, but there were a few times, cycling, there was a few bits in the little teaser, but times when you're cycling through national parks and you're kind of getting mock charged by a bull elephant, or running out of food and water. There were definitely all sorts of parts which weren't great, but it was a huge learning curve. But I'm still just as much of an idiot.
Well, yeah, sometimes you just got to go for it, and you raised an immense amount of money for the Rangers, so no, it's a great feat. So, well, that was absolutely fascinating, Theo. Thank you for taking the time out to talk to us today. I've certainly learned a lot, so thank you very, very much. Really appreciate it. Now, before you go, I'm going to mention the final Beyond Radley talk we have this week, and the one that completes the programme of our talks from the Radleyan Society. It's this Friday at 4 p.m, and I know you've all been granted a lie-in by the warden, but if you manage to get out of bed by then, I can't think of anything better to do than to come along and listen to our talk by William Donaldson, who will talk about his career path in property and the wide variety of career paths open to you in the industry, and also what it's like working for Amazon right now in a time of immense growth. So thank you so much for attending this talk, and thank you again to Theo, and we hope to see you on Friday. Thank you very much, and thank you, Theo. Bye-bye.